Hi, everyone. My name is Will Van Truren, and I will be participating and moderating in a debate on the origins of COVID. I'm going to call the order to session. Everyone's here. First, we'll have the judges read affirmations indicating neutrality and lack of conflict of interest. We'll have the participants introduce themselves, and then we will be having two 90-minute initial opening statements from each side, followed by rebuttals from each side and questions from the judges. So to read my oral affirmation, I, William Van Truren, do not have any conflicts of interest that may affect my decision. No outcome of the debate will have a significant effect on me, my financial status, my reputation, my social status, my business relations, or my personal relationships. I will act in good faith to ignore any preconceived notions regarding the origins of COVID and make my decision based solely on the evidence and arguments presented during the debate and their effect on the likelihood of the proposed hypotheses. I have no business or other relationships with any of the parties or, to my knowledge, their affiliates.
Thank you.
I also affirm that I don't have any conflicts of interest that may affect my decision. Specifically, no outcome of the debate will have a significant effect on me, my financial status, my reputation, my social status, my business relations, or my personal relationships. I will act in good faith to ignore any preconceived notions regarding the origins of COVID and make my decision based solely on the evidence and arguments presented during the debate and their effect on the likelihood of the proposed hypotheses. I have no business or other relationship with any of the parties or, to my knowledge, their affiliates.
Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you. Saar, will you please give yourself an introduction and to yourself and Rootclaim?
Okay, remind me, 3 minutes?
Yes, sir.
Okay, so I'm Saar Wilf. I'm the founder of Rootclaim. What we try to do at Rootclaim, we try to build probabilistic models for contentious issues that are of importance to the world. This is a great example. There's a lot of debate on what is the origins of COVID, a lot of claims, a lot of evidence. What we do at Rootclaim is we try to quantify that evidence and integrate it into a probabilistic model that can provide an actual likelihood of each of the hypotheses. We developed a very detailed, rigorous methodology that tries to overcome a lot of the human biases. I believe we have a process that is far better than any human inference method. And in order to back that up, we offered a $100,000 challenge to anyone who thinks our conclusions are wrong. And this is the process. The process is that each side should present its evidence in front of two agreed judges, and the winner takes home the $100,000. I think this process is going to be very interesting. I think it's something that is will show a methodology that is much better than the current methods that people try to resolve differences. The idea that you have skin in the game, that every side is incentive to win, that is very strong, and not just incentive to just say things that match their beliefs. That ensures that people strongly think what's true. They strongly research. They don't make claims that they can't stand behind. In terms of the people, I'm not a scientist, and neither is Peter. But I think when you try to integrate a lot of evidence and get to a good conclusion, then it's not about being a scientist. It's about being able to assess a lot of data, analyze it, integrate it. Both of us have consulted with scientists, and we think that I think this will be able to bring a conclusion that is far more accurate than current processes.
Wonderful. Thank you. Peter, will you please introduce yourself?
Yeah, I'm Peter Miller. I'm the guy crazy enough to sign up for this challenge. My technical background is in physics and programming. I worked on a Fermilab experiment. I worked on high-temperature superconductors. After that, my career was more in programming. None of that's relevant here. I'm not a virologist. I got interested in virology in 2020 for the same reason everyone else did. I got interested in COVID misinformation mostly the year after that, because it kind of personally affected my family and friends. I had a lot of people that didn't get the COVID vaccines and instead bought ivermectin from internet pharmacies, and I wanted to understand why they were doing that, whether there was any truth to that. I read a lot about that. I started blogging about that. And at the time, I didn't think the lab leak theory was false. I didn't think that was COVID misinformation. I thought that was, maybe 50-50. That's sort of a human bias when you hear two theories and you're not sure. You just say they're equally likely. Last year, I really started digging into it because the conversation didn't seem resolved. I thought it was eventually just going to resolve one way or the other. And after digging in, I came more like 99% on the zoonotic origin side and thought the lab leak side really fell apart. So I'd like to communicate some of the reasons why I changed my mind, see if I can change the judge's mind, maybe even change Rootclaim's opinion.
Wonderful, thank you. Eric, will you introduce yourself?
Hi, yes. My name is Eric Stancifer. I'm an applied mathematician, and while I did briefly work in a mathematical virology research group, I think that the role of Will and I as judges is less to be, the expert that is grading Peter and Saar whether they got their answers right, but more to act sort of as representatives of an inquisitive and skeptical audience that wants to know, like, Saar and Peter are going to make all these claims, and someone has to grill them and see if their claims stand up to scrutiny. So I'm very interested to know what is the true origin of COVID. I don't feel like I've seen evidence one way or the other that decides it yet. And I'm hoping by the end of this debate that I see evidence that decides it in only one direction. Remains to be seen. Okay, thank you.
I'm Will Van Truren. I'm an entrepreneur working in pharmaceuticals. I have a background in bacteriology, PhD from Stanford. I'm super excited. The work that both Peter and Saar have put into this is tremendous, and I think they've done a great service to generating knowledge, which is difficult to generate through other more official channels. And I think that this mechanism of kind of an adversarial truth-seeking is tremendous. So excited to be a participant in this debate. I'll introduce quickly again, just going over the rules for the audience, and then we will have Peter to speak for the initial presentation of 90 minutes. So again, both Peter and Saar will speak for 90 minutes. Peter first, then Saar. Then we will have rebuttals. The total time of the rebuttals is 45 minutes to each side to be allocated as they see fit and in answering to questions from Eric and I. And then there will be a possibility that Eric and I will extend the debate for up to an additional hour if we have more questions in this session. This session is to be followed by 2 additional sessions with continuing the debate on different aspects. So with that, I yield the floor here to Peter for the first speech. Sorry, you're muted.
Sorry, so if you could just show the two hypotheses you need to decide between, so there's a good definition of exactly what is the purpose of the debate.
Absolutely. Sorry, is that in the judge contract?
Yeah, yeah, in either that or MOU, whatever you want. Yep.
I don't have that handy. That's the one document I don't have handy if either of you do.
I have it. Do you want me to read it or just send it to you?
Reading it would be great.
Okay, so the specific question at hand is whether the pandemic more likely began with a natural spillover from wildlife or as a result of gain-of-function research. Natural spillover from wildlife in this context refers to the 2019 outbreak starting due to SARS-CoV-2 passing from an animal to any human without laboratory involvement. Gain-of-function research in this context refers to the 2019 outbreak starting due to a laboratory performing manipulation of a virus such as genetic modification, insertion of a furin cleavage site, serial passage in cell culture, or serial passage in laboratory in animals, and that manipulated virus infecting any human. Any probability assigned to the hypothesis that lab activities caused the spillover but without manipulation is not counted in favor of either party's hypothesis. Let's go.
My turn? Okay. First slide. I want to explain why I'm doing this. SAR originally proposed that we have a debate where we each had scientists helping us, and I actually asked a few zoonotic origin scientists, and they all said this was a bad idea. Scientists think that science should always be peer-reviewed papers, and I agree with them that peer-reviewed papers are actually a better way to solve the truth. Debates are scary. There's a lot of unknowns in terms of how well you'll perform in real time. But the problem is that people don't read those papers, and they do read the news, they listen to podcasts, they hear a lot about the lab leak origin, and they don't really see what the scientists think. So I think there's still a good role for this kind of debate. Before I knew a lot about this issue, I would have loved to see a debate like this. So I guess I'm just going to try and have that debate. I've heard a lot of lab leak claims back when I was more interested in believing this theory. They came up with a lot of reasons why you should think that Wuhan's an unlikely place for a pandemic to start. They say it's 1,000 miles away from the closest bats. They say that the pandemic started on the doorstep of China's best virology lab. There's this claim that there were 3 researchers at the Wuhan lab that were infected, and all these claims about genetic engineering. I'm going to rebut all of that. I think Wuhan's a fairly likely place for a pandemic to start. It's not an inevitable place. The 3 sick researchers' evidence seems to be made up. One of the things I'm going to emphasize is that the lab leak theory is not one lab leak theory. It's dozens of different lab leak theories that contradict each other. Some people call it a conspiracy in search of a theory. This is not the first human coronavirus. We've had 9 of them. 5 are endemic now. We're going to be stuck with COVID forever, the way it looks like. We've also had a lot of these coronaviruses that jump from animals into livestock. So for each of these, you have a original host, which is frequently a bat, but it could be a rat or some other species. You often have an intermediate species. So in 2003, that was the SARS epidemic. That was a civet, and there were a few other animals like raccoon dogs that were also infected. And then that jumps to a human. We don't always find the intermediate host like in 2003. In 2004, we had this HKU1 coronavirus, and we think the host species is a rat. We don't know what the intermediate species is. Sometimes it's just hard to trace these things. We don't know the intermediate species for SARS-2, COVID. It could be a lab rat or it could be a raccoon dog. That's what we're trying to figure out. It's most useful to compare COVID to the 2003 epidemic. The 2003 one was found in markets that sold civets and raccoon dogs. The first COVID cases were also at a market that sold civets and raccoon dogs. SARS started in November 2002. The first COVID case we found was in December 2019, but the first actual case might have been November. That might be one of our first clues. Human viruses are seasonal in the winter. The bat viruses are also seasonal. They're highest in September and October. That's because the newborn bats were born, I think, a couple months before that. They have weaker immune systems. It's like, sending kids to preschool. That spikes diseases. The same sort of thing happens with bats. And if it was a lab leak, that can happen any month of the year. SARS started in Foshan, the 14th largest city in China. COVID started in Wuhan, the 9th largest city in China. There's this talking point that the bats are 1,000 miles away. That's misleading in a couple ways. SARS started in Guangdong province. That's also 1,000 miles from Yunnan. And SARS was also found on Hubei farms. So we know for sure that these kind of viruses can naturally get to Hubei. We also know there were animals from Yunnan sold at the Wuhan market. There's some bamboo rats from Yunnan. So the way I could get there is, in a truck full of animals or through the wildlife trade. This is a map of where those bamboo rat farms were compared to 4 of the closest viruses to COVID. And I've also marked this Tenglong cave as one example because there are also caves in Hubei province. Those have bats in them. They have farms adjacent to them, like civet farms. Before the pandemic, there were about 600 wildlife farms with over 1 million animals being farmed on them, and some of those were being sold at the Huanan market in Wuhan. So the Yunnan does kind of stand out as the highest density of bats, also northern Laos and Vietnam, but the same bats are found also in Hubei and most of southern China, mostly not in northern China. There's some very low density swath through some mountains. Yunnan's human population is also low, so there's less overlap between bats and humans. We do know that, like I said, that SARS was found near Wuhan. There was, let's see, I picked out studies everywhere from 2003 to 2005 that found SARS on Hubei farms. And Hubei also exported civets to Guangdong. So when we've gone back and looked at the genomes from these viruses, it looks like the Hubei civets are closer to the human cases than the Guangdong market civets that we found later. So there's actually a theory that SARS started on Hubei farms and got exported to Guangdong. Will asked me a few questions about this theory over email, so I dug into this a little more. One of the ways you can trace this is through rare mutations. Some of the Guangdong civets have this complete genome in one section that's shared with some of the earliest Guangzhou cases. We can tell the later SARS cases in humans are different because they all have one rare mutation. But some of the early Guangdong cases have this very rare 82 nucleotide deletion, this rare mutation. And when we went and found the first civets in Hubei, they had that same mutation. So there's a good theory there that that virus started on those Hubei farms and then got exported 700 miles south to the town of Zhongshan. There's other theories for how that same mutation could have happened in both. It's hard to prove these things. You can ask how those Hubei civets got sick in the first place. These are generally animals that are taken from the wild and put on a farm. There's a common practice in Hubei where you have some animals on a farm and you go trap another one and you put it on the farm, so you have a new vector for a disease. And then there was a study the next year where they actually looked at wild animals in Hubei, and they found SARS antibodies in several species in the civets, in one kind of badger, and also in this one kind of rat, the Edwards rat. So how did those animals get sick in the first place? Those rats actually had the highest percentage of SARS antibodies, and those rats live in caves shared with bats. When the bats die, the rats eat them. You could have a wild civet that eats one of those rats, then somebody traps a wild civet, puts it on a farm. The Hubei civets are shipped to Guangdong. People in Guangdong get sick. We don't actually know how the SARS pandemic started. We've never found the farm that it spilled over on. Viruses are really hard to trace, and this is 20 years afterwards. But this is one example of the whole chain of events that could have happened, and for COVID it could be something similar to that. So we don't know the pathway for COVID either. It could be from Hubei bats to Hubei farms. It could have been the Yunnan bats to the Yunnan farms and shipped to the market. Several ways that could happen naturally. We have looked for bat viruses that are similar, and in both cases we found bat viruses that are like 96% similar, but no closer. Another thing we can do is look for recombinant ancestors, which is where you look for multiple bat viruses and say, if these recombined in nature, how close could that create the ancestor for these viruses? And in both cases, it's almost 99% for SARS and for COVID. We've already talked, it's not extremely unlikely for a pandemic to start in Wuhan, but we should try to quantify this. A lot of people make this sound very likely because they say it's on the doorstep of China's best virology lab. The talking point's not really literal. It's across town. There's I think over 10 million people in Wuhan, so just getting between these two places, you're going to pass by a few million people. If you just naively say, this is, I think, an older figure of about 8.6 million people in Wuhan. It's about 1 in 170 of the people in China. But an outbreak doesn't start randomly. Outbreaks start in big cities because you need density of people for a virus to spread. The odds are, one simulation says it's about 30 times higher for the virus to spread in a city. So it could infect somebody on a farm, but they're not going to get on the subway and pass it to other people all over town and then send it international. So that increases your odds. You might need a really big city. Remember, for SARS, it was the 14th largest city. And, if it has to be like a top 20 city, then the odds of Wuhan might be 5%. You can see the railway network here. Wuhan's a traffic hub. And I did a bit of research. It's also a hub for the wildlife trade. There's animals and animal products that get shipped through there. There also aren't as many bats in northern China, and the cuisine in northern China is different. So you don't have the same kind of markets in Beijing that you have in Wuhan, and that's the cuisine, and it's also the regulations. Like, they're stricter about regulating the wildlife trade in Beijing or Shanghai. So that might double your odds. I think I'm actually cropping my slide there. The farming in Hubei, like I said, could be different. We do know that they have this practice where they trap the wild animals and put them together with the farmed animals. I'm not certain if this also happened in other provinces. I might just be cherry picking this one example. But we do know that we found those wild civets that were infected in Hubei, and I don't think we've actually ever found wild civets infected in another province. You also don't expect this to be like a Yunnan villager who's the first person to get sick. You do find some antibodies in those people, but you found a much higher rate of antibodies in the animal traders. The people who traded civets back during SARS, 70% of them had SARS antibodies. Though, strangely, they rarely got SARS. So part of that might be you get exposed to these animals over and over and you develop some immunity before you get exposed to the worst disease. So if you're going to pick somebody in China, guess who's the first case? It's probably going to be a wildlife trader. It has to be in a big city for the pandemic to spread, and it's going to be in central or southern China because the markets are different and the bat density is lower and the trade isn't as connected between north and south. So, quick summary of everything I said there. They're very similar. The big difference is we found that intermediate host for SARS. We didn't find it right away. We found it, I think, 6, maybe actually 7 months later by looking at other markets, not the place it originally started. And with COVID, 6 months later, the entire world was on lockdown. China locked down within about 2 months. So you didn't have 6 months to search. There was this limited search at the market. They didn't actually even test any live animals at the market. They killed the animals, as far as we know. They took some samples from some frozen animals and from stray animals. And Hubei farms got shut down in January. Wuhan went into lockdown in January. The rest of China went into lockdown pretty shortly after that. Farms across China were closed in February. They killed tens of millions of animals. Very little testing relative to that. They did test 80,000 animals. A lot of that was later, like during zero COVID times in China. And a lot of that was like livestock and poultry, unrelated animals that don't catch these diseases. So I found one study saying they tested maybe 600 animals from farms related to the market. Also found a study for SARS where scientists went to a Guangdong market that was definitely infected. They tried to trace back which farm supplied that market. They went to, I think, 12 different Chinese provinces, tested all those farms, 1,100 civets, and 0 of those farm civets tested positive. So tracing viruses is hard. I think it's harder than my opponent thinks. And I think both of these are similar pandemics. I think you can get a natural pandemic in Wuhan. I think the odds are somewhere in maybe the 2% to 10% range that it would be in Wuhan versus another city. And I think we can't rule out a lab leak because we haven't found that intermediate host. Until we find that, we can't ever say with 100% certainty that it's not a lab leak. But I think we can make a probabilistic argument to say the natural origin is much more likely. With the odds of a lab leak, we both agree that the original SARS viruses got studied in labs. It leaked a few times. There's other viruses like smallpox leaked back when that was being studied. These are usually small incidents. It's like one researcher or maybe some contacts. There was this flu pandemic in 1977 that a lot of people find very suspicious, and it's never been proven, but people think it might have been caused by a vaccine trial. So we might have had one research-triggered pandemic in history. I didn't work out exact odds here. We're going to do that more in the third debate, but natural pandemics are much more common. Another key to these old lab leaks is they leak viruses that we know about because we're studying viruses we've seen before. And so you can tell these are lab leaks because the people who are infected are researchers, and even if you didn't know who the person who was infected was, you know it's the SARS virus, and it can't be the exact same SARS virus, same genetic sequence you've seen before, unless it's been frozen in the lab. That was actually the key evidence for 1977 that people find suspicious, because it's very similar to this flu that was found in 1950. It's about 99% similar. So it's not clear how it would mutate so little if it was in nature. I guess it could be frozen in nature, but a lot of people think maybe it was frozen in a lab. COVID is a novel virus. It's not that similar to SARS, about 80%. It's 96% similar to this closest virus held in any lab. You couldn't really turn that closest virus into COVID even if you wanted to. So you'd need a lab that has a secret virus, and that's part of the odds here. There has been one novel virus detected as a lab accident. That's this virus called Marburg, which was found in Germany. That was I think a large-scale vaccine production. They brought some animals into a lab. It spread to lab employees. So that's possible. You could have this rare case where some virus is brought into a lab. Again, it's much less likely than a natural origin. In this case, we're talking about gain of function, and that's never happened before in history, so it's kind of hard to guess from the prior odds. I'm going to propose we break it down into probability the lab had the secret starting virus. We'll talk about that in the next debate. They made some manipulations to it. I don't think it actually looks that engineered, but that's a big discussion we're going to have. Probability it leaked. There have been a few studies on that. One I found says it's about 1 in 500 per lab per year, but we can argue those odds. If it does leak, it's about 1 in 3 that a COVID epidemic spreads versus goes extinct right away. But they could have multiple leaks, I guess. And then the big one we're going to talk about today is what are the odds that it makes it across town to this market where the first cases were found, and there's a lot of good evidence linking it to that market, and not a lot of evidence of it being elsewhere in Wuhan. And then probably a last thing's hard to quantify is, could they really cover this up if it was this big disaster? And that depends on how many people know about it, quality of the cover-up, the quality of the sleuths that are looking into it. We'll talk about this more at the third debate, I guess. Another question is, what are the odds there would be some lab leak theory at all? One way people phrase this is, what are the odds it would be in the city with the only BSL-4 lab in China? There are actually 2 BSL-4 labs. But the theories go on to say that the Wuhan lab, it's a lab leak because they're reckless. They did their research at BSL-2. And if it's just a BSL-2 or BSL-3 lab that you're going to blame, how many of those are there? So this is one of the 10 largest cities in China. At least 7 of those cities have virology labs. And I thought a little bit about counterfactual theories. If this happened in Beijing, you could blame this researcher, Qi Yin. He sampled bats all across China, even from this Mozhong mine that's featured in lots of lab leak theories. The labs in Beijing worked with EcoHealth Alliance. There's a lab in Beijing that inserted fern cleavage sites into coronaviruses. They were doing that in 2019. If this happened in Guangzhou, you could blame Jinping Chen. He also worked with EcoHealth Alliance. They did the 2019 work on pangolin coronaviruses. I actually found 2 drastic members who'd already made theories implicating the Guangzhou lab because they had sampled so many bat viruses, because they had these pangolin samples. I think this was Yuri Deigin and Monali Rahalkar had both made theories blaming this lab. And also the Guangzhou lab had been to the Mozhong mine. If COVID began in Nanjing, they had just found this virus ZC45, and there was actually a 2020 lab leak theory that said ZC45 was what they used to create SARS-CoV-2. So you could have definitely had that same theory if it started in Nanjing. These might not sound as good as the lab leak theory we have, but I think you would have had something. There's over 100 of these labs across China. This is also not the first lab leak theory in history. HIV had, I think I found 4 different lab leak theories. One said it was spliced together between 2 viruses. One blamed smallpox vaccination. One blamed the hepatitis B vaccine. One blamed the oral polio vaccine because that was grown in chimpanzee kidney cells. And actually some of the people that are promoting today's lab leak theories were promoting the HIV lab leak theories back then. Also found lab leak theories for Ebola, for monkeypox, for Omicron. I even found one for Lyme disease. People said it came from the Plum Island Animal Disease Center because they did tick experiments. That was later proven wrong. I couldn't find anything for the Spanish flu. I mean, we didn't really know much about viruses in 1918. I did find a theory that blamed aspirin and another that said it was spread around the world by German submarines. So we kind of have a way of always blaming whatever's new. We also have a way of blaming our political opponents and other countries. We think of it as Spanish flu, but in Spain it was the French flu, in Brazil it was the German flu, in Poland it was the Bolshevik disease. Every country nicknamed the virus after some political opponent. In America, COVID's the China virus. In China, it's the American virus. This is a survey I dug up of 1,000 people in China. They were asked where they thought COVID comes from. 52% says it comes from the United States. 10% said it came from Europe. Only 17% said China. So most of these people believe it's a laboratory in the United States. So it's just the mirror image of what we think in the US. And you can, if you want to look for suspicious articles, you can find the same things. There's this August article about a US lab being shut down. You can find mysterious disease outbreaks an hour away from that lab. People like these theories because some people like conspiracy theories, some people are xenophobic, but that's not most of us. Most of us just want explanations for tragic events, and it's more appealing to blame a person, Tony Fauci, whoever you don't like, for a pandemic than it is to blame some random accident in the wildlife trade. So it's clear there'd be some of these theories, no matter what the truth was. And none of these panned out for previous viruses. That should give us a prior on this stuff, but it's not proof. We still have to evaluate the evidence to figure out what happened. Before I get into that evidence, I also want to point out, like I said, there's not one lab leak theory. I'm going to lay out a few of the major ones. See if I can load a video here.
This weird new tool.
And you're going to watch a YouTube ad.
We'll have your classified briefings, but the declassified information now, in September of 2019, 3 things happened in that lab. One is they deleted the sequences. It was highly irregular. So researchers don't usually like to do that. Second thing they did was they changed the command and control of the lab from the civilian control to the military control. Highly unusual, and I've been involved in dual-use labs when I was in the military. And the third things they did, which I think is really telling, is they let a contractor redo the ventilation system in that laboratory. So I think clearly there was strong evidence that there was a significant event that happened in that laboratory in September. It's now been declassified. You can read it. I'm sure there's more classified information around it.
Is the audio coming through okay for you guys when I play videos? Yeah, great. So when I was first studying this, I was trying to build a timeline of, when I want to know where something comes from, I look at where and when, questions like that. And this is Robert Redfield saying there's 3 different reasons why the lab leak happened in September. But then if you look at other headlines, you see this famous one in the Wall Street Journal saying there were 3 sick people in November, 3 sick researchers. And that's not just a time lag. the other people say it started September 12th. It's not going to take 2 months for these healthy young people to end up in the hospital. And I read every government report that's been produced on this, and I found it was just as inconsistent. I read this House GOP report, which said it happened in September, and that was spread around the world in these October Wuhan military games. I read the Senate GOP report, said October or November. I read this Department of Energy report, which actually pointed at a different lab, not the Wuhan Institute of Virology. I read Biden's intelligence report, which said, it was a mix, like the CIA and the FBI couldn't agree. And none of these reports actually said anything about these sick researchers. I thought that was surprising. That Wall Street Journal article just cites anonymous government sources. And then when you look outside the government reports, it's not any clearer. Some people blame another lab entirely. This is the Wuhan Institute of Biological Products. Some people look at October because they looked at cell phone records, or they said there's some roadblocks outside the lab. There's this Vanity Fair article. They look at November. They've come up with like a secret language of Chinese officials. They found some memo, and they didn't translate it literally, but they think it describes a lab accident. A bunch of people who actually speak Chinese disagreed. Could line up with the 3 sick researchers, but obviously it contradicts the September theories. And then ProPublica, they walked back those claims. It got a lot less attention than the original article, and that was after the U.S. intelligence report said there was nothing suspicious about that lab safety training. Again, these theories can't all be true. The September theories just don't make much sense to me because it's such a highly contagious virus. If it started in September, it'd be all over the world by December. Also, this database thing probably isn't even true. It looks like maybe this is just an inaccurate monitoring system, and it was probably available after, probably until mid-2020, early 2020. The other thing I noticed when I read through the theories is that the theories don't agree on how the virus was made. Like, there's this, I guess maybe the most common one now is it's a bat virus and they put a furin cleavage site into it, but there was an earlier one that said it was this chimera combining bat and pangolin viruses. One says it was like stitched together entirely from different pieces of RNA. One blames ferrets, one blames mice. One says it was created in cell culture. There's an early one that said it has HIV genes. There's one that it says it's a self-spreading vaccine. One says it came from this mine shaft, which is suspicious because the 50% of the miners died from whatever that disease was, so you'd actually need a loss of function research if it's that theory. And then there's the, it came from a US lab theory. On the second day, I can probably prove that some of these methods wouldn't actually work to create COVID, but you can't rule out every possible method. You can rule out like 90% of these. So let's actually get into the data on where COVID started. This is the WHO report, 174 confirmed cases in December 2019. When I used to believe this theory, I would look at things like, this is December 8th, there's this first case and he's not linked to the market, so how can you say it started at the market if the first case wasn't there? Maybe it was spreading already. And people dug into this over time, and it was actually 2 drastic researchers, I think it was Brian Reed and Francisco, that first noticed that that patient actually got sick on December 16th, and that was just a recording error. And then Michael Warby came to the same conclusion later. That guy had some other hospital issue, I think it was a dental emergency, and then he got COVID later. So you excluded him, you find out the actual first known case was at the market. This is Wei Guishan, who's a shrimp vendor at the Huanan market. And we had a little discussion over this on email already, and it sounds like we wanted to dig in a little more on the first few cases. Rootclaim said that the first 2 he said were visitors. So I dug into that claim, and it was actually, one of those 2 visitors was transportation staff at the market, so he works there, he just doesn't have a stall. And the other one is a repeat visitor who buys seafood for a hotel, so he could definitely be infected on a previous visit. Those 2 are not the very first. The very first is Wei Guishan, and then after that it's 2 more vendors. So, 4 out of the first 5 work there. This is a map from another drastic member.
Sorry, Peter, can you go back to that slide?
Yeah, what's that?
I just wanted to see, is 57F, is that Wei Guishan?
That's her age and her gender for each of these.
Okay. Okay, I'll ask the question when we get to the next slide.
So these could even be connected if you look at their occupations. She sells shrimp to hotels. The outsider buys seafood for his hotel, and the guy who doesn't have a stall is transportation staff that might be delivers them between. You don't really need to contact trace these because there are actually cases that we haven't ascertained because some people get mild COVID cases, and these are more like the first 5 hospitalized cases, or the first that got sick enough that we noticed. I dug a little more into the first known case, and I translated some Chinese videos from her. Some people argued over when exactly she got sick. I think she started knowing she was sick on the 10th, but the bad fever started on the 11th, and that's, I got COVID this summer, and that was exactly my experience. I knew I was sick, and then the next day it was like fever of 104. She lives very close to the market. She might walk to work. That's different than the December 16th case who takes the subway. And she doesn't do really anything outside of work. She doesn't socialize. She doesn't play mahjong. She thinks that she got sick in the bathrooms that she shares with the wild meat sellers at the market. She was treated at this clinic very near the market. I think that's also very near her house. We can tell that she brought COVID to the clinic, not the other way around. By the end of the month, the clinic was shut down because they were all sick. And then when she got sicker, she went back to work briefly on December 15th because she had to make money still. And she went to another hospital because she was too sick. That hospital remembers patients coming in sometime in that range, December 10th to 16th. And when she was just out of it for a few days in the hospital. When she came around, she was talking to people there who said there were also Huanan cases at Tongji Hospital. I marked the location of these two. So that's the big question here is, was COVID everywhere, or was there some sort of bias that led us to only find it at the market? So, if you pick a random person in Wuhan, there's maybe 1,000 workers at the market and 10 million people. It's like 1 in 10,000, they work at the market. And then if you have 5 that are all there at the market, 4 workers and 1 who's a repeat visitor, that's incredibly unlikely. But maybe there could still be some kind of bias. But it's also the hospitals that are independently finding these cases. So there's the 2 that I mentioned there, and then there's 3 more hospitals that I found that all had early cases in the market, and actually it was often 50% or more of their early cases were from the market. The person that probably first discovered the market connection was this Dr. Zheng Yishan. She had 2 patients with pneumonia on December 27th. That was a man and a woman. They both had suspicious lung scans. She had experience with SARS 20 years prior, and it made her think it looked like SARS, so she ordered a lung scan for their son. He wasn't ill, but he had the same abnormal scan. So she discovered human-to-human transmission. I think China denied it for over a month after that. The government denied it, but it was known very early on. The family actually had no link to the market, though. And she didn't notice them because they were from the market. She just noticed them because of the symptoms. Over the next 2 days, she had 4 more COVID patients, and all of those were linked to the market. So she talked to her colleagues at 2 other hospitals, and both of those had Huanan-linked patients. Over at Wuhan Central, 4 out of the 7 were market-linked. After they talked, the link was known, so that's about December 29th, and that alert went out after that. And before that date, it's greater than 50% with a link. And then it was later discovered that the 2 first patients that she had lived 2 kilometers from the market. And it's the same story at other hospitals. Even this is Zhongnan Hospital over right next to the Wuhan Institute of Virology. They didn't find these before that cutoff, but they just ordered a search for all of their pneumonia cases with an unknown cause as soon as that alert went out, and they found 2 cases, and those just both happened to be market linked. One worked, and the other had friends who had worked at the market. You can also look at the first lab that got samples. 3 out of 5 of their first samples came from market-linked cases, including the earliest one. All those were hospitalized before December 29th. That makes perfect sense if it started in the market. It's extremely unlikely that all these separate places would find 50% market-linked if this was actually all over Wuhan. We don't have full ascertainment of these market cases. Wei Guizhou is just the first known case. She's not patient 0. It's the more deadly a disease is, the easier it is to contact trace. So MERS is 30% lethal, and that's pretty easy to contact trace. SARS is actually a little bit hard at 10%, and COVID's less than 1% lethal. So when you get COVID, you don't always know how you got it. Some people are asymptomatic. Some people have a mild case. You can make genetic models based on the diversity of the early cases, and those say when she got sick there might be 25 cases, about 50% odds. It's probably less than 100 cases at that time. I'd say it's a good odds that the first patient is actually a wildlife trader at the market. They might have a milder case because they've had 10, 20 years of selling these animals and exposure to similar viruses. They might just have a mild case for random reasons. I mean, most people do. And they might also lie about their illness to avoid punishment. It could be an adjacent vendor. It's probably not a customer because then that wouldn't keep spreading in the market. You could easily have solved this puzzle if China had tested everybody at the market for antibodies. They could say which wildlife traders had antibodies. Either they never did that or they never shared that data. And they could have also just asked detailed interviews of these people, and that could have solved it too. But we've never heard of those interviews. I'd also point out that with SARS, the first 7 patients, so these are the index cases for 7 different towns that SARS went to, and of these I found only one of them had known contact with civets. One is a market vendor, that's patient 7. She's not a trader at the market though, she's just similar to Wei Guizhou. She didn't sell the animals, but she worked at the market. 2 of these are restaurant chefs. One of the restaurant chefs had direct contact with a civet. The very first one, he's listed as animal contact, but I looked it up, and his animal contact is he cooked chicken, and I think he cooked domestic cat, but he didn't cook civet. He wasn't like a civet farmer or anything like that. So it's hard to trace these viruses back. First cases are at the market. This was, I guess I should talk about the history here. Michael Warby was not originally sold on the natural origin theory. He was open to lab leak back in 2021. He signed this letter with a bunch of other scientists who wanted a better investigation because he thought the WHO report wasn't good enough. And the first papers he wrote in 2021 were like the stuff I just told you about, looking at the early cases before there was ascertainment bias. How were the first cases found? And after he convinced himself that it wasn't ascertainment bias, he went on to looking at the pattern of the cases in Wuhan in December and discovered that these are abnormally well clustered on the Huanan market. It's not just these orange dots are people that work there, but the blue dots are the ones we don't know how they're connected, and yet they're still geographically connected. And this is a kernel density estimate, it's just one way of averaging the data, making a heat map, and the highest probability contour is just perfectly centered on the market for these unlinked cases. So that could support the idea that this is community spread out the door of the market and from person to person. You can also look at how the cases spread over time.
Can I interrupt, Peter?
Yeah.
On the previous slide where you're showing these density contours,
Yeah.
if I understand correctly, this 1% contour is supposed to contain about 1% of known cases after you do this kernel density averaging?
The kernel density is, there's some parameters in this model, It's like you put a Gaussian, bell curve on each point, and then you can play with the bandwidth there. So if you had a really low bandwidth, it would just be this point cloud. And if you had a really high bandwidth, it sort of averages the locations. And I think they used a bandwidth of 3 kilometers there to come up with their centering technique. There's some arbitrariness there. I've recreated this code. If you want to see it with like different bandwidths, you could ask me after the debate and I could show a comparison there.
Okay,
I think if this... Go on, Eric.
What I was going to ask is, if in December 2019 there were on the order of 200 cases, then a 1% contour, doesn't that make it sound like there's just 2 cases at the market? I'm not sure how to interpret
I think that's
this.
more like a probability estimate of most likely origin. It's not a...
Okay.
It's
that was
not
my question.
a
Thank you.
percentage of cases. I'd have to produce some raw heat maps for you to explain this better. I don't have the slide for that, but we can get into that. The spread is, these are terribly low resolution maps from the WHO report, but there's still high enough resolution to see that the initial cluster is near the market and it grows and spreads away from the market over time. And this technique has been used for other diseases, though not usually respiratory diseases. This is 1854 cholera outbreak, and they traced it back to a water pump based on finding sort of the center point of the cases. There were also 2 early strains of COVID. The earliest lineage B case is at the market. That's who we talked about, Wei Guizhan. And the earliest lineage A case came later. That was the one that lived 2 kilometers away that we already talked about. And the odds of them being that close, if you just make a model saying that it's equally spread all over town, the odds are, it's p equals 0.034, that they'd be that close of all these other gray dots of possible locations. And then we only have 2 lineage A cases in December, and they're both similarly close. So the odds, if you pick them at random, that they'd both be that close are 0.001. One of these was sampled before there was any known ascertainment bias back in December 27th. And you can trace back every case in the world back to these 2 strains. So it seems like the market's the origin of the pandemic. That seems like a good theory, but let's try a few other theories here. Let's say it's the first super spreading event. This is cases in the market over time. We talked about 5 of these already. I've only marked 3 of them here. And then a week later, it spread more widely in the market. A week later, it spread even more widely on the west side, and it's also made it across the street to the east side of the market. And a few days later, it spread a little more. You can't go a full week because the market gets closed by then. So what I'm trying to convey here is when you say super spreading event, that's usually like you go to an event and you get 50 people sick. One person spreads it to everyone. But what's happening here doesn't look like super spreading. What happens here is like a slow burn through the market of person-to-person transmission. So super spreading is definitely the wrong place. You could call it the first cluster, maybe, but for super spreaders, not the right term. Is it a likely place for an outbreak to happen? Some of the lab leak people say it's in the top 5. Warabee's group looked up data on this, and they found this is just comparing to other markets and shopping malls. It's way down the list even there. There are about 1,700 places in Wuhan that see higher traffic. If you weight this by traffic, it's again like a 1 in 10,000 coincidence that it would be there. There's only 4 wet markets in Wuhan selling these wild animals. There are about 20 shops in those markets. The Wuhan market has more of those shops than any other market. So that makes it the most likely place in Wuhan for a natural virus to emerge, but unlikely as a super spreading location. Was the case search biased? We already talked about this. This is a common objection. And it's kind of funny in a historical sense because that was what Warby spent 2021 looking at. But once he got to his second paper, everyone objected that it was still a biased issue. So the data I already talked about, these early cases are heavily linked to the market. There's probably a period after that where there is some bias towards the market because we have that connection. And then up until January 18th, there's this criterion for looking for market connection in the retrospective search. Looking for market connection when you're diagnosing a new case. But then after January 18th, they've removed that criterion. And most of these 174 are found, after January 22nd. So the retrospective search should not be biased in that way, or for that specific reason that's stated. It's not the January 18th criterion thing. Another way to think about it is just kind of common sense. If you think this search was biased to only find market-linked cases, it's weird that it finds 2/3 are not market-linked. And it's also, if you think it was somehow, I don't know what the mechanism would be where it would just pick cases that are close to the market naturally, because this is like hospital records. They're not going door to door looking for cases. But even if you imagine there's some mechanism for why it picks them close to the market, this same search is finding these blue dots, unconnected cases, even outside of Wuhan, elsewhere in Hubei, and far, far away from the market. So I'd want a theory for why you think it's biased that incorporates those facts. You can look for other examples, like the first cases were at the market. Also, when you look for early clusters, these early clusters start with somebody exposed at the market and then infecting people outside rather than the other way around. When you
Peter, sorry to interrupt. Can we go back 2 slides to the map? Yeah, perfect. So I know that this is an important point of contention, and I think this will continue to be this. So those clusters that lie far outside of the market, what were the diagnostic criteria for whatever, let's say that northern point? Is that pneumonia of unknown etiology? Is that something with an antibody? They've got an antibody to COVID. Like, what are the criteria shown in this map?
They're not antibody tests for sure. These are going to be hospital records. It would be pneumonia of unknown etiology. Yeah, they go through. Sorry, go on.
No, so if there were to be cases not recognized here, what would be the quality of those cases? Those would be things that would be at hospitals outside where there wasn't a pneumonia of unknown etiology but doesn't get linked. Like, I'm just trying to understand how much faith I should place in this map in belief that like this truly represents all of the cases, or what's the probability that there are cases that are missing, and what might be?
It's definitely not all the cases because these are hospitalized cases. So
Sure.
It could be 20 times this many cases, but there shouldn't be a reason why the hospitalized cases are clustered differently than all the cases. I mean, there's subtle things like places where older people live are going to have a higher ratio of hospitalized cases, and we can. When we get to the arguments phase, I have some maps of where like the elderly population density is, and we can look at those to see if that's a confounding factor. Warby's 2022 paper looked at data like that before making that conclusion.
Were there any, in this context, were there any studies that you found of retrospective kind of microbiological sample analysis from surrounding hospitals that went back to that time period? So say significantly away from the market, where they looked back and they took, any samples that were saved as part of like normal procedure and tested them. Anything like that?
Yeah, I do have a few slides for that actually. I'll get to those in a minute. We have a few other data sources to look at if you think the WHO report is biased. This is the Weibo data, which is it's like I think it's a Chinese version of Twitter, or it's some social media app, but they also had other features, and they made a feature where you could report you were sick with COVID and ask for help, something like that. And that was actually February data, but people could enter a retrospective date into it. It's not really great for diagnosing the origin because there's only maybe 3 December cases, maybe not even 3. And this is more something to compare against compared to the original. This more represents where the population in Wuhan is, because this is January and February and it's spread all over town by now. So you can center it, and it's still centered on the north side of the river near the market. but also that could be the origin, and it could also be more of a population density effect. We also have seroprevalence data, which should be an unbiased way to look at it because you're just sampling random people around town after the pandemic's rolled through. And we can look at the districts that had the highest seroprevalence. And those are the 3 districts that are containing the market or adjacent to the market have the highest. It's not like by the lab on the south side of town. Another study confirms that. We also have the excess mortality data from the lab. This is pneumonia mortality, and if you look at where people died of pneumonia, that went up on the north side of the river, district surrounding the market, before it went up on the south side or the rest of the town. I'm going to skip this for now. We'll talk about reasons why China's lying. Could something else nearby be the origin is an interesting question, because like Eric said, you've got this kernel density estimate. It's not an exact method for proving where it came from. It's just one of many clues that if all we had was that heat map, I don't know as we could blame the market, but we have that heat map and we also have, the first 5 cases were there. You're already looking at the market for a number of reasons, and it's a likely place because of the wildlife that's sold there. There's this railway station there, there's the hospital, there's the Wuhan CDC. A lot of people have blamed the Wuhan CDC. This is a different lab from the Wuhan Institute of Virology. There is a researcher there, Dr. Tian, who had a history of working with bats. We don't know how many live animals were there in December. It's possibly 0. It's certainly lower than the number of animals at the market. No one was doing gain-of-function research there. We have some information from Eddie Holmes, who asked his Chinese colleagues recently. He thinks that this Dr. Tian was tested multiple times and PCR negative and antibody negative for COVID. No long-term storage of bat samples at the lab, and his colleagues said they had a meeting at that lab December 7th to 8th, and nobody there was talking anything about COVID or COVID-like cases. Dr. Tian went around Hubei sampling animals to look for COVID when the pandemic started. He found some bats that had a virus that was 80 to 90% similar to COVID, not close enough to be the ancestor, but in the same ballpark. He wasn't, as far as I know, he wasn't allowed to sample in Enshi. I got that information from Michael Standard, who's heard from Dr. Tian or Dr. Tian's colleagues. He did test wild raccoon dogs, sort of near Wuhan. He tested 15 of them. They were all COVID negative. A lot of people point to that to say that there's no infected raccoon dogs in China. I think it's too small of a sample set, and also it might be the wrong direction. He might need to look west instead of east. It's also weird to quote his research if you also think he started the pandemic. This isn't 100% impossible that's the origin, but it's much, much less likely than the market origin, in my mind. I think this is more like a bait-and-switch tactic in these internet debates. So I found a 2020 video where they spend 10 minutes talking about the Wuhan lab and all the research they're doing, and half that time they're talking about the Wuhan Institute of Virology, and then when they show the location, they show the location for the Wuhan CDC, and they just bait and switch there without telling you that they've changed labs. And sometimes it's more of a rhetorical bait and switch. This is a strategy for internet arguments where you make some bold claim, but then when people challenge you, you back off to some less controversial, more defensible claim. So here it's like you talk about gain-of-function research, you talk about these foreign cleavage sites, you talk about Fauci being in on the conspiracy, Peter Daszak, and if somebody says, hey, it's not found anywhere near this lab, you say, well, the Wuhan CDC was near the market, maybe it's that. But what's key to these arguments is as soon as somebody stops challenging you, you go back to talking about gain-of-function research. You haven't changed your theory to say, oh, it's actually the Wuhan CDC. And if you can blame the Wuhan CDC, I looked how many BSL-2 and BSL-3 labs are in Wuhan. This is a map from Drastic. They show 9 to 11 locations that could be suspicious. They also draw lines across the maps, like they say the subway line connects the Wuhan Institute of Virology with the market. If you can draw 6 different subway lines and all these labs, it's pretty easy to connect any origin with some lab. There's another theory I found where they found this early case. I think this is that December 8th, but not actually December 8th case. And so for a while they said this was proof of a lab origin because he was close to one of the 2 campuses. This south locate. So there are 2 Wuhan Institutes of Virology. I don't know if I mentioned that yet. There's a southern one, which is the BSL-4 lab, and there's a northern one, which is the BSL-3 lab. And the theories can pick between those 2 locations and swap whenever they want. So for a while, that case was near that southern lab, and they found a bus route that connects them. It's 100 different bus lines, a bunch of different labs. I think if you can blame the Wuhan CDC, you can kind of make a theory for anywhere in Wuhan. If I did have to say it didn't start at the market, I think there's still more likely things. Like you have this train station in the neighborhood. I did some research on volume of passengers, and it's almost 2 million people per month going through that train station. And it offers service to southern cities like Guangzhou, where if you think there's more viruses there, that could be connected. And you only have a few dozen people working on viruses at the Wuhan Institute of Virology compared to these 2 million travelers. So I would rank other scenarios. I really think it's infected animals at the market. That's what I'm arguing in this debate. But you could also have an animal trader at the market who got infected wherever farms he's coming from, whatever, then brings the virus to the market. You could also comes into Wuhan via train. I still think that's more likely than a lab origin if you work it out. You also have this frozen food theory. This is popular in China. They think this is number 1, or maybe it's number 2 after a US lab leak. I don't really know how to place the odds for this. It could even be higher than a lab leak because we do have one case where this happened in China, which is the Xinfadi market in Beijing. And I think maybe there was a few other smaller cases where an outbreak started from. This was when China was doing zero COVID. They got the virus imported back into China on frozen food from other countries, and that caused new COVID outbreaks. So we know for sure this can happen. We don't know for sure that a lab leak gain-of-function accident can happen. That's speculation. Why I don't really like this for that initial COVID is it makes sense that it can get on lots of packaging and frozen goods when the virus is all over the world, but it doesn't make a lot of sense when the virus is only in a few animals, not widespread. That seems unlikely to me that it would get to the market that way. And then you've got the American. If you can blame the Chinese labs without proof, I think it's fair to blame the American labs without proof. And I think we can rule out that it came from outer space, but that didn't stop somebody from writing a paper saying that. I actually looked up, that same person wrote a paper in 2003 saying that SARS came from outer space. So that's just their thing. Kind of like the people that like to blame HIV and COVID on lab leaks 20 years apart. There were searches for earlier cases in a lot of ways. This is a lot of text. I'm going to probably skip the exact reasons. If you read some earlier reports, there were cases on December 1st, 2nd, and 7th. This is back in 2020, when I believe this stuff. Again, it's like if you have several cases before the market, even like a week before the market, how do you know it's the market? And the WHO report said they did investigate these people and came up with reasons each time why it was misrecording, or like it was pneumonia that responded to antibiotics, or no COVID antibodies tested later. They did do a search across hospitals all across Wuhan, 80,000 hospital records. They found 92 that sounded like COVID symptoms, but there was no trend over time. Like COVID's an exponential growth disease, but you have one case, 4 cases, back down. That doesn't look like a growing epidemic. Also, none of these patients formed clusters. There was no geographic trend among these. And when they did the WHO report, they tracked down the people that were still alive or just accessible, found 67 of them. They were all antibody negative. you could, your antibodies don't last forever, and this is over a year after, so that's not 100% proof, but these probably aren't COVID cases. There are also a couple media articles I dug up. There was this famous article that said there was a November 17th case and 9 cases in November. One clue there is it said there's 266 cases overall, and that's the same number of cases in the WHO report. If you include both the confirmed ones and the 92 that they just found with this retrospective search. So it might actually be a valid leak of a government source. It's just more like they were still vetting these early cases, and they ruled out the November ones for the same reasons they ruled out like the December 1st case. I also found this tabloid article about a British guy living in Wuhan who says he got sick on November 25th. I don't really believe most of the things I read in the Daily Mail. His COVID symptoms don't exactly sound like COVID to me. It's like he had a cold for a week and then he got better and then suddenly it became COVID, and he said he has a cat that also got COVID and his cat died from COVID. He does say that he shopped at the seafood market and he thinks he caught the virus there. So could just be a tabloid story, or it could actually show that the virus was at the market, weeks before we know about. Found another, I think this is also a Daily Mail article that's describing 2 November cases. It has a screenshot from Chinese data, which the date of onset is listed as November, and then the diagnosis time is listed as January. If you just change the date of onset to January, this data makes sense. Saying that they were sick for 2 months straight before being diagnosed makes a lot less sense to me. I think that's probably just a typo. And then the professor who gave the data, before the article went to press, he said, oh, this was a mistake. He'd entered the data wrong with the 2 cases. But people go back and say this is, concrete proof that they're hiding these 2. There was this search across Wuhan hospital records looking for trends of this ARI is acute respiratory infection, ILI is influenza-like illness. There's no pneumonia, and there's no uptick in any of these until maybe like December 8th. It's still in the normal channel range up until December 1st. You're maybe starting to see something later in December. You can also look at excess deaths in Wuhan. There's no spike until January. You can look for excess deaths in Hubei. There's really no spike at all. Actually, those go down, which is kind of a common feature around the world. When you lock down a city that doesn't have COVID, you get less traffic deaths, things like that. This should answer your question earlier, Will. They tested stored influenza-like illness samples from both Wuhan and Hubei. What is this? So this goes October through December, and non-Wuhan, it's a few thousand samples. And it's 6,400 samples in Hubei, and then 600 samples in Wuhan. And none of these samples are positive at all in 2019, but you are starting to pick up some positive samples in 2020. And they also did a study on saved throat swabs from sick people from October through January. There were no positive tests they found in 2019, but they did find a few positive samples in January 2020. And when you map out those positive samples, again, it's this cluster on the market plus 1 found elsewhere. They also tested blood banks in Wuhan from September through December, and none of them had COVID antibodies. The first COVID positive antibodies January 5th, 2020. They also looked at large-scale events. They just talked to the medical teams for each of these things, like the World Military Games. And they found things like military games, there's people coming from all around the world, so you had some malaria, some gastrointestinal illnesses, but none of these events reported pneumonia. And you can also look at Baidu data for what what people are searching for. Like, you can track COVID around the world by looking at, I can't smell is one of the things people will type into COVID. There's also a thing where like people were reviewing candles and saying that the candles got like 1-star reviews because they didn't smell at all. And you can track COVID waves from signals like that. So this is one source I found which just looked at cough searches, and you don't really have any signal before December. Are there any other questions about that case search, Will or Eric? No? Okay. So you can also track down where a pandemic started with genetics. So you can build a minimum spanning tree, I think this is called. And so that should be an unbiased way to figure out who the index cases are, because you're not just building this, you're not putting these people at the cluster because they started at the market. You're coming up with what's the tree that has the least mutations that connect all these cases together. And if you build that tree, these are color-coded by date, so the blue ones are the earliest, and one of the clusters is the market outbreak, and the other cluster is this lineage A. The WHO team was confused at first because there's this earliest case, and he's one mutation off of the cluster there, and if he's first, how do you know that that's actually the root? But we found out both that he's not the earliest case, and that the WHO report had misidentified him, and he's actually lineage B with no mutations. That was also something that, I think that was Francisco from Drastic that figured that out. And the other thing we found out is that most of these intermediate cases are almost certainly not intermediate cases. These are sequencing errors. They share mutations with other cases. There's a few other signals there. We'll probably talk about that at the second debate, I think, whether or not that's true. A more modern version looks like this, where we filtered out the intermediates, and we've tagged who are the early cases. So, this lineage B is rooted on the market for sure, and this lineage A is rooted on one of the cases that was right near the market, and also there's a sample from the market that's really close to the root, and there's this person that was found by Zheng Xishan, who lived very near the market. That's one mutation away from the root. So the market's the center of the pandemic, not just geographically from these case searches, but also genetically. And to be clear, we're building these trees not just from, like this one's built from, I think, every COVID sample in the world up to February 15th is the cutoff I used. So if you had other cases that were not detected in Wuhan, and there's more genetic diversity that was missed there, you should still see that genetic diversity when it spreads into the world. Like here's a graph of diversity with respect to time. At first, it's just one virus, two viruses, this is the theory. We think it's spilled over twice, and those are almost the same. But as it gets out into the world, it mutates, it gains more diversity. And you can even just fit a regression line to that and figure out where it started or when it started from when it had no diversity, and that gives you early December. And if the Wuhan cases were, I think these are all color-coded yellow here, if they were undersampled somehow, if China was missing lots of them, when it got out into the world, you should see a big jump in diversity because you'd see what was missed by the sampling. But that's not what happens. It's the same kind of trend line. If you do more careful math on that, rather than just fitting the trend line, you get about the same answer. This is one from the WHO report that said most recent common ancestor was December 11th. And you can fiddle with that a little. You can make it a week later, a week earlier, whatever, if you change some parameters on how fast the virus mutates. It's not a perfectly accurate method, but it can still rule out things like that September origin. You can also, like I said, there's no jump in diversity as it goes around the world, so you can do that calculation based on only the samples found at the market, or only the cases in Wuhan, or all the cases in the world. and they give you pretty close range of the same most recent common ancestor. Most recent common ancestor here would be like this large blue dot. When the pandemic first starts, it doesn't necessarily start this rapid spread. It could have sort of a stuttering transmission for a small amount of time first, where it's going one patient to another. But you can't have that for very long. Either it's going to go extinct, or it's going to just spread everywhere exponentially. So the actual first case can be a little bit before the most recent common ancestor, and you have to build some kind of model for that. This was Picard in 2021. So again, this is like Warabee's thought process of he's not sure about the lab leak at first, so he tries to figure out, is it biased, but he also, there's these other papers, like the Picard 2021, where they're just trying to do science on how many cases could there have even been, how much earlier could it have been if it's not the market. And their model then was saying it's probably most likely the end of November. This is like a graph of probability of a different origin. So you can still support early November or even maybe the very end of October with a very low probability, but you have a very high probability on it being end of November. You can do the same trend line thing separately for the two lineages. It kind of gives you an idea that B started a little bit before A, because B has more diversity than A. And you can, in 2022, Jonathan Picard did this model of, based on the amount of genetic diversity, how many cases could you have had in December or November? And he's saying probably less than 2 hospitalizations by December 1st, most likely 0 hospitalizations by December 1st. So you can really confirm the case search and the genetic search say about the same thing. You can confirm that these lineages are different times. It's about a week or maybe 5 days between the two, so it's close, but B looks like it started earlier. And there's no case search evidence for November cases, and we can also rule them out as very unlikely from the viral diversity. And the September origin theory should just be completely gone based on this. And the market is the center of the pandemic from both of these methods of looking, genetics and geographics. We also have the testing data within the market, which is these environmental samples. They took 900 of them. They took animal samples, but those started 3 weeks after the market was closed. And we think that none of those were live animals. They say the sources were unsold goods kept in refrigerators and freezers, goods kept in warehouses in a few cases, and they looked at some stray cats, a stray dog, some stray rats. They weren't testing the live wild animals that were being sold. So 73 of the environmental samples were positive, none of the animal samples were positive. We know this data is not made up because there's leaks of it or we know it's not made up retrospectively because there's leaks from it in early 2020, and the numbers are the same. We also found an uncovered version of what China thought in January 2020. They said it's highly suspected that the current epidemic is related to the trade of wild animals. At the time, George Gao is the head of the Chinese CDC, I believe. He suspected bamboo rats are the host. Another famous scientist, Zhang Nanshan, also said it's bamboo rats or badgers. Then Gao was complaining that the market was clean before the samples were taken, that the crime scene is gone. How can we solve this without evidence? And then in May 2020, he's saying, oh, maybe it wasn't the seafood market, maybe that was a secondary infection. And then in 2021, when the WHO report happens, China says there's not even wild animals at the market. So no verified reports of wild animals being sold there. So there's a cover-up happening here, but it's not a cover-up of the lab. Now, we think of this as like an argument, like the one I'm having with Rootclaim, where it's natural versus lab. But there's really a third side to this argument, which is the Chinese side, which says that the virus didn't start in China. They support this frozen food theory, or they say it was otherwise imported from Europe or maybe a US lab. And so the fact that they're not confirming the lab is not suspicious so much. They're just denying everything. They don't want responsibility for the pandemic. Other countries have asked that they pay reparations for the pandemic. That might be the trigger. There might also be some political conflict there where like the US is pushing a Chinese lab leak theory, so they decided to push a US lab leak theory on their own population in response. We can look for patterns in those environmental samples. So these are the earliest sampling dates, January 1st and 12th. And you have of the wildlife shops, only 2 of them tested positive. One is inside of a freezer. The other is a bunch of samples off, let's see, 2 carts, a metal cage, a feather removal machine, and one off the ground. I mapped the earliest cases that we know about. I don't think you can prove that much from this connection, but I've seen a lot of other people saying that it can't be the stalls because there is no pattern. And I want to say that there is at least a pretty good pattern there. I don't support the contrary claim. So there's this funny story.
Can you clarify what we're looking at in that previous slide? What are blue dots?
Each
What are
blue
brown
dot is a
rectangles?
case from December 15th and earlier. And I think we already found that this one, and that one are actually the first 3. And then maybe there is like a secondary outbreak that's near one of these stalls that's happening. That'd be December 14th to 15th.
And what are these brown rectangles?
The brown rectangles are shops that sold wild animals. And then I've highlighted, this is Street 6, Shop 29, which is the shop that sold raccoon dogs that's suspected of being the start of the pandemic. And there's this second shop, which is Street 8, Shop 25, which is the other one that has positive samples. I frequently call this the hedgehog shop, which is less likely in my estimation of the data, but it's interesting that both tested positive.
All right, thank you.
So that's just comparing early cases to the 2 places that we think could be the origin of the pandemic and how close they are. Like, it's pretty easy to say the pandemic didn't start on the east side of the market, but since it did start on the west side, how well related are the early cases to those locations? So this funny story that Eddie Holmes went to Wuhan in 2014, and his Chinese colleagues actually took him to this market, and they took him there because they wanted him to see a place that was a likely place for a future pandemic to start. And he went to the market, and he took a photograph of raccoon dogs in the market because he knew that those were infected by the first SARS virus, and those are a dangerous species to sell. And then after COVID started, he noticed that those pictures were taken in the same shop. I translated the signs. This is 6th Street. This is the same shop numbers. And when you look at the positive samples, all those elements are in the same photo. There's 2 positive carts. There's 2 carts in his photo. There's a feather remover machine. The raccoon dogs are sitting on top of birds in a cage. The sewage outside the shop tested positive. If you look at the raccoon dog cage, it's sitting right on top of the sewage crates. There's drainage in front of each of these shops, but that's not drainage for the bathrooms. That's like you wash whatever waste comes out of the shop, and it goes down this trough. And when you look at where they tested these drains all across the shop, all across the market, and they found 4 that tested positive at first. One of those 4 was the raccoon dog shop. And then they tested them again in February, and it only tested positive in 3 places then. And it's the raccoon dog shop. And if you map the directions of the drains, it's 2 places that are downstream.
Peter, a question on that analysis. I think I
Yeah.
did not understand that originally reviewing the slides. So those drains, the wildlife drains, are not commingled with the closely located bathroom, the human bathroom drains. Is that
Correct.
correct? Okay.
Yeah. They do eventually commingle with it once they get, I think once they get to the main street. And I don't have it marked here, but the main street drains also, all of these test positive through February. But I think that's like city sewage at that point. So, of course, that's going to test positive. I can't see the clock the way I'm viewing this. How many minutes have I gone through?
You're at 10 minutes remaining.
10 minutes remaining. Oh, wow. Okay. To go fast. So this was blamed on the bathrooms, or sometimes they blame on mahjong rooms. Sometimes they say sampling bias, and we ruled out sampling bias when we got the when we got the total numbers, and we saw that they did lots of sampling in other places, and the ratio for the shop is very good. But people still, I talk about these zombie talking points as like, you can't kill any talking point for the lab leak. It gets disproven, but it still gets trotted out. Now they've changed it to say it's 220 samples. They did that by adding up the animal samples. You can actually tell that China added up the animal samples, or they were focused on a few shops there. You could tell they only looked at the warehouse shops for 629 and 825. And we look at which animals they tested for those shops, and it's snakes, it's not raccoon dogs, it's nothing really relevant. We have proof that there were live animals at the market. We have photos on Weibo. We have a study from 2021 showing exactly what animals were in each of these shops. We know which animals they tested, and it's not really the ones that we care about. In 2022, we saw that they had data from the market, or on DNA data for the animals. During the last year, there was a lot of speculation that there's no wild animals at the market, a lot of jokes about like the raccoon dogs are like Bigfoot. And then we finally got a copy of that data in 2023. China finally released it, and that proved that there were raccoon dogs in that one suspicious shop. There were raccoon dog samples without human DNA. The birds, there were also ducks in there, and the birds in Eddie Holmes' photo look like ducks. They were selling a lot of animals in that shop, though, so it's hard to tell which was the infected one. Those animals don't match the WHO report, so they didn't really track that down very well. The lab leak theory adjusted to deny that new evidence is important in a lot of different ways. They blamed a zoo in Wuhan. They said that we never denied there were raccoon dogs. This is sort of, it's an evolving narrative. Eventually it settled on the Jesse Bloom narrative that there's not enough raccoon dog DNA in there, but they came up with a bunch of excuses before that. Those samples had other animal viruses in them. Gonna rush through so I can get through. We figured out who owned those shops. Michael Standard did this investigative reporting, and he found that 3 shops in the market had been fined for selling illegal wildlife back in 2019, and 2 of the 3 were those 2 suspicious shops. He talked to the owners. They were evasive. They lied about selling animals. One of the owners said that the lab leak started in Fort Detrick. So he might, the people that started the pandemic don't even necessarily know. We think there are 2 spillovers at the market. I talked about this with genetic. We'll talk about this more at the second debate, really. That's not normal for an outbreak. Usually it's like the Diamond Princess, 1 introduction, 1 spillover. Give me a warning when I hit 5 minutes, please. There's several ways to find the root. We can do this Bayesian analysis that says lineage B is 96% likely to be the earliest one, but lineage A is slightly closer to bat viruses, so a lot of people think maybe that came first. Some people, Jesse Bloom said that predicted that A was not associated with the market, and Corby predicted it was associated because of the 2 cases were located. A has less diversity than B, so it's weird if it's the one that came first. And in 2022, we finally got the samples from the market. 4 of them were sequenced fully enough that you could figure out the lineage, and one of those was lineage A. So you have this triangle here of, the origin shop, the A sample, the earliest case. So all the genetic diversity in the world of COVID is found in this tiny section of one market in the world. And the PCAR22 paper...
5 minutes.
Was that? 5. Okay, thanks. Gave an elegant theory for why it could be closer to bat viruses for A, but also B came first, which is that you had some diversity in the animals at the market, and it mutated into B, that spilled over first, and then the earlier one stayed in the animal a little longer, and then that spilled over a little later, and that would produce this pandemic. You can also have 2 spillovers by chance, and that's only about 3% likely in Picard's current model. And if you don't have that explanation, you need to explain why it looks like B came first, and the odds of that are quite low. You also have to explain why the 2 cases were so close to the market. That's also very low. So we can combine all these probabilities. Lab leak spreads at the market, 10,000 chance, looks like 2 lineages. Those shops were fined for illegal wildlife starting the same month. I said 1 in 12. It's probably more like 1 in 6, because I would have said that whether it's November or December. And any Bayesian analysis we do has to account for all these coincidences. I would want to see earlier cases to disprove the market. I haven't seen that. A lot of people have looked, and they found the same articles I did. And then we have the 3 cases at the lab. This actually comes from Trump's State Department. Lab leak was started by Steve Bannon in January 2020, and this guy Miles Guo. They worked with Li Mengyan to make the early theories. They went on Fox News with this. They said it was a bioweapon. They all went on to say the 2020 election was stolen. Both these guys were later had some legal trouble. The Miles Guo was defrauded people out of $1 billion when they searched his apartment. His apartment building was lit on fire. 2021, this kind of morphed into a new version of the lab leak theory. And you had, it was really spread by this article in the Wall Street Journal by Michael Gordon. That came from a Trump State Department memo first. And it came from this guy, David Asher, who says the 3 got sick. Sometimes he says November, sometimes he says October. Sometimes he says it was a monkey bite at the lab that caused this accident. Sometimes he says one of their spouses died. And the Wuhan scientists were acting normally this whole time. They were traveling to conferences. They were going out to dinner. And the guy who spread this in the Wall Street Journal is the guy who announced that Iraq has weapons of mass destruction. He spread multiple articles about this. Every time he spread one of those articles, there's a huge spike in Google searches the same day as his article, because other articles reported the same thing with the Wall Street Journal as the source. This changed in 2023 to be 3 scientists at the lab with these names. The guy who reported that also says the U.S. has alien spacecraft a week before that. And then it got amplified by the aluminum tubes, Iraq WMD's guy. There are a lot of reasons to doubt that those 3 people were sick. I've gone through some of these, other than just the people that are spreading it. And the rest of the government intelligence can't confirm this. It looks like a misinformation campaign by other people who are involved with other misinformation campaigns who can't keep their story straight. It's highly politicized, but the Wuhan market is the most likely place for natural origin. There are lots of lab leak theories. Most of them must be wrong. There's still some possibility for a November lab leak, but I think zoonosis is more likely. And we'll need to still talk about genetics at the next debate, and we need to look at Rootclaim's views on all the same evidence and see how he differs. Ask me questions if you have any time left.
You have 1 minute and 9 seconds.
What do you guys think? Oh, we can hear Trump for a minute, maybe. He thinks there were body bags dumped outside the lab. That's his keep.
I think we can use that time better. Maybe kind of a larger scale question about some of the data generation process. Where do you think, if any, kind of sequencing data or any of the kind of data that would be confirmatory or kind of or be dispositive on the question of what viruses were where when, do you think any of that exists in places in the Chinese CDC or in WIV that hasn't been released? Do you think that they've sequenced basically everything and made it public? Do you think there's essentially any information that's not in the public
I mean,
record?
if they had a secret virus and they're hiding that, then that's, just positive for the lab leak. If they have antibody testing at the market of vendors, that would be pretty important to me. Also, we don't know how many of these environmental samples we know how many of the sequenced, but we don't know if there's still any that could be sequenced.
I got you. Okay, wonderful. Thank you, Peter. I'm going to start a break for, what do you guys want? 10 minutes, 5 mints?
If you want to finish a sentence, that's fine. It's okay if you take a minute longer.
Oh no, we're.
Okay.
I gave my whole presentation except for the videos.
Okay, how long?
Up to you guys. I'd like to grab another coffee, so maybe 7 minutes.
Okay.
Sounds good.
Yeah,
Okay.
Thank you,
See you
Peter.
guys.